So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Medventions lecture series, Sunnybrook's weekly lectures to support an atmosphere of innovation in the field of medical technology innovation. I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker today, Mr. Robert Harrison, who's managing the Research and Development Spine Division at Baylis Medical, and who will be talking us today about a very interesting topic, medtech-based entrepreneurship. Before I get into the specific introduction of today's lecture, I need to make just a very quick few announcements. Our next lecture is scheduled for Thursday, September 28th. We're having Dr. Harold Woodlinger, the president of Woodlinger Consulting, and he will be discussing the various business models that are typically utilized in the medtech field. Again, all the lectures are on Thursdays in this lecture theater at 5 o'clock. Registration is now open for all October's lectures and workshops. You can now register for these events. Please go to sunnybrook.ca/medventions and you'll find all the information on these upcoming events. Finally, for the medical biophysics students who are taking this lecture series as a course module for the medical device innovation and entrepreneurship, the last day to enroll in this course is Monday, September 25th. So please register if you haven't done so. And also, if there is a group that you would like to work with, and if you have an idea about a medical device challenge or a medical problem and a device that you would like to propose for your class projects, you please email me this information by end of day on Monday, September 25th. My email is Ahmed, ahmed.nasef, N-A-S-E-F, @sunnybrook.ca. If you didn't get the email, you can just see me at the end of the lecture and I'll give you the email. So yeah, back to our lecture today. Taking the decision to become a full-time or even part-time entrepreneur in the medical device field provides an exceptional opportunity to deliver on ideas and technologies that will probably transform the future of healthcare. However, this journey that seems to be very satisfying and rewarding is in fact embedded with many problems and hurdles that, if not managed skillfully, can even prevent the best idea from reaching to patient care. Again, we're delighted to have Robert with us today, who will be sharing his professional experience and using Baylis Medical as a case study to walk us through or give us a guide on how to navigate our ideas forward and how to pursue medtech entrepreneurship. A little bit of a background on Robert. So Robert obtained his bachelor's degree in biological engineering from the University of Guelph and master's of applied science in biomedical engineering from Dalhousie University. He's an author of several peer-reviewed scientific publications and over a dozen issued and pending patents. Robert has over 12 years of industry experience and is currently the research and development manager, as I explained, for the spine division of Baylis Medical in Mississauga. In this role, Robert has led the development of several platform technologies from initial concept to worldwide commercialization programs, which have resulted in commercial partnerships with multinational organizations, including Kimberly-Clark and Medtronic. Robert, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for delivering this lecture.
Thank you. Great. Well, first I wanted to thank Ahmed and the rest of the Medventions administration for inviting me. As Ahmed mentioned, I've been in this industry for about 13 years now. And for all 13 of those years, I've been coming to Sunnybrook to try to figure out how to make better medical devices, collaborating with both researchers and physicians. And so I've learned so much by coming through these front doors, and it's a real privilege for me to be able to reflect maybe some of those learnings from a different perspective, from maybe a bit more of a business perspective back here at Sunnybrook. So a little bit about me, and to advance. Okay, so as Ahmed mentioned, I got both my bachelor's and my master's degree in biomedical engineering, and so I took a fairly straight line into this field. And I'm still in love with the idea that you can pair technology and medicine to come up with an innovation that's going to advance healthcare. It never gets tired. And one of the things I give talks to groups of students who are considering getting into med devices, and I say this is this is the major thing, that if you have the passion for it, that's the #1 ingredient to help you be successful in the field. And I honestly believe that. We used to, and I don't think pedigree matters too much. I think certainly a technical degree, and we have wonderful institutions here in the Greater Toronto area, is enough. I used to joke that, you didn't need a PhD from MIT to do med device, and then we hired a PhD from MIT, and he leads up R&D for our cardiology division, and so I don't use that example anymore. But as I say, it's the passion that really matters. So through the 13 years at Baylis, I've had a few good ideas, a pile of bad ideas. I always say to my staff that I give great advice about 50% of the time, and I don't know which 50. But I've been on the journey for the last 13 years, and certainly we've been developing medical devices for only about 17, so I've been there for most of the time. And we learned a few things along the way. So what I'll try to do with today's lecture is just share a few of those learnings. What I can't really coach or mentor on is identifying the next medtech unicorn and riding it to a $1 billion valuation. But what we did is we placed much smaller bets, and through those we were able to really develop a sustainable business that could grow and continue to kind of increase our impact in medicine over time. And so that's really the angle that I'm going to take. So an overview of the topics. We'll just briefly touch on what are the goals of medtech entrepreneurship, I think from my perspective in any case. Go over kind of a feasibility checklist so you've got an idea how to evaluate that idea. I'll talk a little bit about the Baylis journey just to give some context of how it happened for us. And then I'll walk through a case study, and I'm going to use the case study of a technology called Osteocool that we developed, and I'll talk more about it later. And then I'll just kind of summarize with some sort of pearls of wisdom, if you will, on a few of the hurdles in development. So looking at ideation to regulatory affairs, IP, development, market access, and your clinical evaluation plan. Okay, so maybe if you guys don't mind, I'll throw out to you for a sec. What would you consider the goals, or maybe one of the goals of medtech entrepreneurship? Does anybody have any thoughts? Yep.
Making an impact.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, having an impact. Yep.
Helping someone.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you guys have hit on the core one, right? The one that sort of gets us out of bed every day. And so I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I'd say that through your technology or through your idea that you are going to generate a meaningful advance in medicine. The other one, and it's part of it, is to build a sustainable business, because without a sustainable business, and sustainable is the key word, you can't do the first piece. And there's lots of ways to start with the idea and end up in a non-sustainable business model. And it sounds like you'll have an entire lecture on that next week. And so all the steps along the way have to keep that in mind. At least that's been our experience. Where it leads you is pretty neat. And I'm not kind of trying to put Baylis on any kind of a pedestal here, but this is sort of what it turned into for us over years of development, is that your mission goes from, a meaningful advance in medicine with my idea and a sustainable business to something that can be much bigger. And so ours, for example, is pretty broad spectrum to be a world leader in conception, development, production, and sale of state-of-the-art medical products that improve the lives of people around the world. And that leads you to core values upon which you take your decisions. So I wanted to jump into the feasibility checklist, and these are kind of just jump right into some of the pearls of wisdom, I suppose. And this is all with the benefit of hindsight, which is much, much easier than looking at your idea kind of fresh and then trying to plot a course, admittedly. But these are some of the things that we apply to new product ideas, and we have been for some time. And the first is, and I think one of the most important is to try to make the problem small. And I mean that in a bunch of different angles. So making sure that the technology that you need to develop isn't a massive step from where you are now in terms of your knowledge or what you have in an idea and a prototype. It means not taking too much on in terms of advancing medicine. That major pushes or major advances in medicine are extremely challenging to achieve, but even incremental ones can have a massive impact on the lives of people. And I'll find some more examples as we go through about how this plays out. So the first bullet, though, you don't make it so small that it's not meaningful. I mean, certainly it has to be that there is some subsection of patients out there that are going to be meaningfully improved by your product. And you hold on to that as a bare requirement. One of the reasons to make it smaller is that unless you have scale, and the presumption here, I think I'm talking from the standpoint of you have a great idea and limited financial resources. Unless you have a lot of scale, 1% of a $2 billion market is a road to failure. And one of the reasons of that is that you end up swimming with the big fish. You know, the tens of billions of dollars worth medical device companies like the Medtronics and the Abbotts of the world. And those guys are focused on the big markets, and they're not inclined to give up 1% of market share to anybody. And so you end up in a kind of a more complicated competitive situation. From another perspective, the commercial scale you need is really challenging too, right? If it's a $2 billion market versus, like us, the other example I use is a 50% of a $40 million market. 50% of a $40 million market, maybe that's an enterprise of 20 people. And if you go up by 2 orders of magnitude, now you're looking at an enterprise of 2,000 people. And so the commercial scale to support a massive market is massive, and to support a smaller market is smaller. And so the whole enterprise of trying to launch a medical device and get it to the patients, right, which is your goal, becomes easier in smaller markets. The other piece of it is that the larger fish aren't swimming in those waters. So one of the phrase used is blue waters versus red waters. So the red ones are the shark-infested ones, and the blue ones, there's no other big fish, and it's much easier to operate there. The other thing you get is a lot of excitement for blue water projects. You know, it's easier to partner with either on the engineering side or on the clinical side with these new ideas that nobody's pursued before. And so one of the other analogies that we like to toss out a lot is it's hitting singles is better than hitting home runs. And this is with respect to the idea of starting a business, that each at-bat is basically your attempt to start your business. And if you follow baseball, I'm a big baseball fan, so I love this analogy, but you guys would know, you've probably heard of Aaron Judge. He plays for the Yankees. He's a massive human, and he's crushing 500-foot home runs all the time. But Aaron Judge strikes out 5 times in a row before he hits a home run, and then he strikes out 5 more times. And he has the luxury of going up to bat 4 or 5 times every night. In starting, your medtech enterprise, you go to bat once, and the goal is to get on base, is to be playing. There's so the kind of neat analogy here, or the neat, I don't know, is it witticism or what? There's basically one way to hit a home run, right? You got to hit it over the fence between the foul poles. There's 8 different ways in baseball to get to first base. And I'll leave you with that. It'll torment you trying to count all 8. The last couple are really obscure. But it makes the point, I think. One of the things that comes from making the problem small, and one of the tools you can use is to know what you are and what you're not. It really drives focus. And I'm going to give the example of Osteocool, which is a technology for treating metastatic tumors that grow in the spine. And in the pursuit of that technology, we had to answer what we were and what we weren't. And so certainly we didn't have a technology for the ablation of all types of tumors. It was very specific to bony tumors, and not just bony tumors in the vertebral body, and lytic, not blastic. And those decisions, you face them as you go through the development process. And it's worth constantly trying to narrow, and then reflecting back on, is it still meaningful? Like, am I still getting out of bed in the morning to pursue this? And for a bunch of reasons that I'll talk through in the presentation, this will help you succeed. So that's one of the big ideas, is make the problem small. There's a few other key elements on the feasibility checklist. I think you'll receive, I think, entire talks on a few of these topics. One is for sure that you identify the regulatory pathway in the key markets early. So know that you have a path to market through the regulators, be it Health Canada or the FDA or a notified body to get into Europe. Reviewing the IP landscape early isn't mandatory, but it's a really good idea. It gives you a really great source of inspiration. When you start digging up patents around your idea, you'll get all sorts of adjacent ideas. It also allows your technical development to go alongside your IP development, so that if you knew what the IP landscape was, where you could innovate and where you're going to have problems because other people already innovated, it'll be an input to your development process. It won't let you get too far down the road before stepping squarely on someone else's device. And it's amazing. This happened to us. We were developing and have since launched a technology unrelated to Osteocool. It's for the treatment of the intervertebral disc after a disc herniation. And we had gone into prototype development. So we had started the project and we were a ways down the path. And another medical device company, Synthes, they published a patent that was exactly the same as the concept that we had taken into prototype. Like, we couldn't have drawn the patent pictures better. And that was just bad timing. We certainly had been looking. But, you could imagine a similar example where that comes out maybe near the start of your development, not as far in as we were, and you pivot. We did pivot. We took that and we said, okay, we can't go right over this patent now that they've got it. And so we pivoted. And ultimately that led us to a more creative and we think a more stable solution. And so these things, when you find them, are not necessarily bad. They're usually good. Freedom to operate, what that means is just that you're not going to step on someone else's patent. So if somebody owns intellectual property in a particular area, it's good to know about it. If things go well and you are in a position to eventually exit, larger companies are very wary because they become much bigger targets for lawsuits. So they're very wary of picking up technologies that don't have a clear freedom to operate. One of the things I mentioned about keeping the problem small is to keep the technological hurdle that you're overcoming small. And I would go further to say that you should seek technologies that are close at hand. So things that or things that are knowable in your sphere of, in your collaborative sphere, or in the people that you pull into your projects. Another way to look at this is to make sure that you can kind of see the end of the development road, that there are no big unknowns in the technological side of your development. This helps you get out of concept. You cannot stay in concept forever. At some point, that the development path you're on is a strong path. It satisfies all these other feasibility requirements. And if you can clearly see the end, that's a great trigger to say that you're ready to get out of concept and make a more meaningful prototype that could go into animals, do tons of bench work, that kind of thing. A final check mark, and this is related to being able to see the end, is being able to answer the question, will the final product be world-class? So you might be able to say, I see a technological path forward, but when I look in the market that I'm trying to get into, I see competition and their technology is better. It's worth being upfront about that and asking yourself, do I need to be at that level, that world-class level, to compete? And I don't think it's absolute, but I would suggest it's better if you're there, if not improving upon, of course, what's already out there. And a final one, and I've alluded to this, I think what you're working on has to get you out of bed in the morning. We had an opportunity really early in our journey to pursue a therapy. We were developing, and I'll talk about it in a sec, but our RF generators is one of our kind of core technology platforms. And we had an idea that was shared by a few others, particularly in Silicon Valley, of using RF to treat wrinkles. So basically for cosmetic surgery, that you could apply low doses to RF to the skin of the face, and that would cause the collagen to denature, and it would cause the face to tighten up. And we were a very small organization at that time, probably about 30 or 40 people. And we had to choose between, do we go down that path or do we go down other paths, such as investing a lot more in interventional pain or cardiology. And it was an easy decision. Even though cosmetic surgery is lucrative, that wasn't what we wanted to get out of bed. It's not that it's a bad thing. I think it's important, but that's not what we wanted to get out of bed for. And so we took a different tack. Interestingly, the company that ultimately succeeded in that they sold to Valiant a few years ago, Valiant Pharmaceuticals, for like $250 million. So it was a good idea, which is interesting. It would have checked all the boxes for us. But you do what you want to do. I think it really matters. Okay. So to provide some context, I'm just going to walk through the history of Baylis. So how did it work for us? From 1986 to 2001, 100% of Baylis's revenues were from distribution. And it's a really neat story how it started. Gloria Baylis was a nurse in Montreal, and one of her patients and a physician she was working with needed to get their hands on a neuroembolization catheter that was available only in France. And so she went and figured out, how do I import this neuroembolization catheter into Canada so that I can give my patients the right level of care that they need. And in doing so, she understood the pathways of how to import. There were more patients that needed that technology, and so she set up a business, and it grew from there. Distribution does some good things for you. One of the things it did for us is it taught us how to sell. Like, what does a sellable device look like? And once I've acquired a sellable device for distribution, how do I sell it? And it generates revenue, which is good, of course. But it's not a sustainable business. It's very cyclical. So if you do an excellent job as a distributor and you build up a market in Canada, as the case was for us, then the company who owns that technology comes direct, because now it's viable for them from a business standpoint to come direct with their sales force, and they take it away from you. And you got to start over and build up and start over and build up. And so that led us to take the decision to start developing our own medical devices. And so in 2001, we started not only developing but manufacturing medical devices in-house. And there are just two technologies which I'll talk about. Really, there were two, and there were others, but two kind of important bets, if you will. One was a technology for perforating cardiac tissue with RF. And this had two applications that we were looking at. One application was in the treatment of babies with pulmonary atresia. So this is blue baby syndrome. And it's basically when a baby's born with a malformed valve that doesn't allow blood to pump back up through the lungs. And so the babies are literally blue. It's a fatal condition if it's not treated within the first few days of birth. And the de facto treatment for it around the world was open heart surgery, which had a mortality rate of 50%. And so the idea here was, why don't we just feed a wire through a vein in the groin into the heart and poke a hole using RF. The RF is on for just a second. It cuts through the tissue. Cut a hole, dilate that hole. There's still no valve there, but the blood circulates, the baby survives and can grow. And it was a wonderful application of RF technology. And to this day, it's the gold standard around the world for treating pulmonary atresia, at least at the acute phase. And what's really interesting about this as a case study is it's absolutely meaningful, but it's not a sustainable business. There's only, I think, in the order of hundreds of cases a year. So you can't build a business around it. The other application for perforating cardiac tissue is to gain access to the left side of the heart. And so at the same time, we developed a catheter to help surgeons, interventional cardiologists, gain access to the left side of the heart. They were typically doing it with a Brockenbrow needle. They would feed a needle through the groin up into the right side of the heart, and they would poke on the septum with a sharp needle until the needle poked through. And there were risks of that needle poking all the way through out the left side of the heart and causing a perfusion. The technology and the feel of the technology was so different to the ICs that it didn't catch. And so we, at the same time, we're seeking other ways to build a sustainable business. Bear with me, this is going to be relevant. The other bet that we took was on modernizing RF energy application for interventional pain. And so what you see up top is it's an RF generator made by Radionics for the treatment of interventional pain. And the idea is that you would apply RF to a nerve to burn a small section of that nerve so that it stops transmitting pain signals to the brain. And you literally, well, not literally, but it certainly seemed like you needed a degree in electrical engineering to operate this. It looks like an airline cockpit. And this was like 2000, like that was the state of the art. And so what we did is we modernized the RF generator. We put a GUI on it. We dramatically improved the usability. And And we were able to establish market share through that advance in technology. And because we got our foot in the door with that advance in technology, we're then able to innovate clinically and come up with new applications of RF that were targeted to specific anatomies where you had pain conditions. And those would be things like treating the SI joint when there's chronic pain in the SI joint. There were no therapeutic options for that until we innovated into that space. And it was this thrust that we were able to build revenue and have a sustainable medical device business. In 2009, a note on how we got that to market, I guess, a small Canadian company. It's worth noting as an aside that building a sustainable business that focuses only on sales in Canada is really challenging. You really need to reach out into other markets. And so to do that, in this case, we distributed through a company called Kimberly-Clark. They had a medical device division. And Kimberly-Clark, through their sales and marketing muscle, helped us build this up. And they ultimately acquired all those technologies from us in 2009. In and around 2009, we had fixed the issues with the Toronto transeptal catheter. That was the one that was trying to gain access to the left side of the heart. We had a technology that now felt much more like a stiff wire. It was the right product and was getting uptake in the market. And so we pivoted largely into a cardiology company. And that's really allowed us to grow to the scale that we are today is as a cardiology company. But we did a few other things. There were some of us, including myself, who had worked in spine. And so we also developed a technology called Osteocool, and we were ultimately able to divest that technology platform as well. And that's the one I'm going to use as a case study going forward. And just a little bit, that's the energy transeptal needle. So what we are today, we export to over 50 countries. All of our development and manufacturing is here in Toronto. It's just in Mississauga, basically at Ranforth and 401. We have over 70 engineers, approximately 100,000 square feet of production space, sales offices in Montreal, Boston, Munich, and London. We sell around the world. Interestingly, that energy needle, the one I just showed previously for gaining access to the left side of the heart, because of some nuances related to reimbursement, we have 95% market share in Japan. So it's not something that we planned. It's not something that we saw coming, but Japan became an extremely important market for the growth of our business. And at this point, we have about 380 employees. So kind of take a break here. And what I'm going to do now is sort of walk through just a case study of an idea that we had in and around 2008, 2009, and how it sort of evolved ultimately into a platform technology and reflect back on some of those feasibility checklist items, as well as hopefully offer some other kind of points along the map to guide you. We did our needs assessment. I think Brian Courtney spoke on this last week. We did our needs assessment around this idea that bone metastases develop in 50% of cancer patients, and the issue with them is when they develop in the vertebral bodies of the spine, you get significant pain, of course, and instability. That instability can lead to spinal cord compression. And it was pretty well documented that both the pain with the bony mets was being underdiagnosed and undertreated. So obviously it's an extremely multifactorial disease, and that this element was perhaps underserved. RF ablation certainly had the potential to augment the patient care pathway in the treatment of these bony mets, where chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery are not providing local control, right? So this could help. It's another tool in the multidisciplinary tool chest of the care team. And proof of need or proof of principle was already established to an extent that RF ablation for bone tumors was already demonstrated in literature, and there are interventional radiologists taking devices that were not for bone, they were for soft tissue ablation, and using them there because they felt that needed to be a tool. So what did the market look like? Was it meaningful? As we trace it down from the total number of folks, patients living with cancer, the number with bony metastases and cancer-induced pain worked out to, if we combine the US and Europe, up to 500,000 a year. And so it was a really important market from a size perspective. And so we developed some therapeutic goals, and predominantly that we would provide therapeutic thermal coagulation of tumors in the vertebral bodies to palliate pain and improve the quality of life, provide local control of tumor progression so that you didn't have further instability issues, and prevent spinal cord compression. One of our goals was that this would be used adjunctively with kyphoplasty or vertebroplasty, which is the filling of the vertebral body with cement in order to restore its compressive structure. And certainly to reduce or eliminate reliance on NSAIDs or opioids for pain control, again, kind of pointing to the improvement in quality of life. And the marketplace at that time was really interesting. I mentioned there's literature suggesting that interventional radiologists were already using on-market devices such as the Covidien Cool Tip or the Rita machine. Not off-label, but these were designed for soft tumor ablation, and they're applying them to the bones of the spine. And because they weren't designed for that, they were kind of shoehorned in, and the results were promising, but it wasn't designed for that. There was a competitor in the space called Define, and Define had identified the same need and had developed a system specifically for this, for the ablation of metastatic disease in the bones of the spine. And it's often a question of, is this a good thing or a bad thing that there's a competitor in this space? And it's largely a good thing. This does a bunch of things. It means that you've got there's another group of people pounding the pavement and working out the clinical need for this product and basically building a market. They also, if they're running ahead of you, are going to establish some of the regulatory pathways so that you can get to market effectively in their slipstream. So an analogy would be, riding a bike and catching up with somebody and just hanging out behind them for a while, and they don't even know you're there. It gives you quite a competitive advantage. We were also able to look at what they had in terms of intellectual property and what their technology was. And we talked about making world-class device. We felt that the technology we had, not in hand, but we could see it, was going to be better, that we could do technically a better job at ablating these lytic lesions in bone. And so ultimately, we viewed it as a pretty positive thing. The most meaningful, I mentioned, is to have them go ahead for regulatory. And this is so in August of 2010, they received a 510K. 510K is basically regulatory clearance for a particular class of devices so that you can market in the US. And one of the things about receiving a 510K is that you can only market based on your indications for use. And one of the things that Define had done is had procured, lack of a better word, indications for use that were very well suited for marketing this technology. And we were able to then follow in their footprints. So as we looked down the feasibility checklist, it looked quite good. It was a big enough market to be meaningful. We could treat enough patients, I should say, to be meaningful. The market size was about right. Although Define was there, they weren't one of the big fish. They were a small fish. There were no other big fish. And as I mentioned before, it was hitting a single, and we were knowing what we were. We weren't trying to treat cancer, big C cancer. We had a very particular slice in the patient care pathway for a particular there's a group of cancers that show up as bony events in this one. We had a regulatory pathway. The IP landscape looked good around Define. We had the technology close at hand. It was based in part, or at least it derived from what we had built up for interventional pain. We were excited about it. And I added this one here, what did the sales channel and reimbursement look like? I don't think this is mandatory to get started, but at this point we started worrying a bit about it. And I'll talk more on that later. Okay, so the idea looks good. You have an idea. I suggested before a medical device is it's the intersection of technology and medicine in a very thin slice of technology and medicine. And I think what I'm sure everybody here already appreciates is that the work required to create that medical device, the biomedical engineering is much, much bigger. That, starting from the biomedical physics, the interface between your device and your tissue, going towards the medicine, from the anatomy to the pathology, the etiology, all the current treatments, and then backwards into the technology, right? Not just the technology you have at hand, but what you're going to need to bring to bear. It's just a massive undertaking. And when you start, I guess, down the road, I think it's worth acknowledging it. And this is in part why you try to make the problem small. This is so much work. And I guess another way to look at it is to say that in order to develop a world-class device, you need world-class expertise in the field of the technology that you're pursuing, and especially in the disease state in the field of medicine that you're involved in. And I guess to paint maybe a picture, like, it would be our expectation as biomedical engineers, the ones maybe leading these programs, that you would go to a conference where the world leaders, the world thought leaders in a particular field of medicine are, and you should be able to go toe-to-toe with those people because of all the studying you've done to get yourself to that level. That's a requirement for our biomedical engineering team. And I think it's what it takes. It's how you know that you haven't left anything off the table. And the innovation shows up there too. And you'd be surprised, like, the surgeons or the clinicians that as engineers we interact with, certainly, and even as clinicians, if you're pursuing a medical device, and you seek out some of these thought leaders, they're so excited to talk to somebody who's thinking up there with them and who has something new to bring, a new idea or knowledge about technology that they don't have, or what have you. That there's a synergy there that's really, really powerful and can really, let's say, manifest into something that's world-class. And as if this wasn't enough, this is the even broader reality, right? That not only do you have the intersection of technology and medicine, you got to worry about IP, regulatory. I haven't put everything up. Reimbursement's important. Design for manufacture. Can you make it and scale it at a cost that's going to make sense? And there's more. Something we've an axiom at work is that this is a business of details, and it really is. And it's no one else is going to do it for you, I think, is the thing. There's lots of people that will help in a real way. They'll help, but you and your team, if you've started on one of these ventures, have to be the ones that own the information, and it's doable. Okay, so back into development. We had the idea and we're going forward with it. Where were we at in terms of technology? And I might mention there's a bunch of folks in medical biophysics. We always start with the tissue and the tissue device interface. This is the heart of what you're doing, is where the rubber hits the road, where the technology hits the patient. You start there and build out. When we looked at the existing technologies, I mentioned that they were out there. One of the issues with bone is it's both electrical and a thermal insulator, and all the technologies that existed now are called monopolar. So what that means is that the energy is basically flowing back and forth from the application site to a grounding pad, which is on the leg, dispersive electrode leg. And the issue was that depending where that lesion was made and where the electrode was placed next to the bone, it would change the size of the lesion or the heating profile in a way that wasn't always predictable. And so the technological advance, and again, it's not a huge step, it was a baby step, was to say, let's make it a bipolar so that both the active and the return electrodes were next to each other. All the RF energy is trapped inside the bone. And in that way, the hypothesis was we can create very controllable, repeatable lesions, and that's how it worked out. Again, in hindsight, maybe it doesn't do it justice. It's an incredible amount of bench testing. We went so far as to say, wouldn't it be great if we could put 2 bipolar probes in at the same time, and how would those thermally interact, and just tons of modeling and mapping empirically in tissue. And understanding that interface doesn't stop in the lab, of course. One of the things that we did here was to take a next step into basically a tumor model that could go on the femur of a rabbit. And so this was collaborative work that was done here with the team at Sunnybrook. And this was to establish some proof of principle that if you took the type of tumor, the type of lytic tumor that we were going to be most frequently seeing in a vertebral body, how would it react to the application of thermal energy? Would we see a large-scale necrosis of the cancerous tissue, but not of the surrounding cortical bone? So answering some of those questions was a key element of the biomedical framework. And the next step in that was to move to a non-cancer, but a closer to human model, which was the porcine vertebrae. I watched this equivalent lecture from last year. Cameron Piron gave it, and one of the things he said was to develop in your own backyard, and I couldn't agree more. I mentioned that we've been coming through these doors. I've been coming through these doors for as long as I've been in the industry, and these collaborations have done so much to help us advance our technology and get it to market. This particular program, we were engaged with Sunnybrook from 2009 to 2014. Medtronic now owns this technology. They continue to collaborate with researchers here now on clinical outcomes. And here's, in this picture, a couple of our development engineers, Mike Gofeld, who's an interventional pain physician here in Toronto, and Albert Yee, who's a spine surgeon here at Sunnybrook. And there are a multitude of grants and other funding opportunities available from governmental organizations. We were able, in this case, to leverage those and take full benefit of them, from them. So at this point, having started with the tissue and established the technical feasibility and proof of principle that the technology is doing what you think it's going to do in tissue, I think you take the next step and you start scaling for commercial use. And there's a huge effort that goes in here. It's probably, if concept phase is 5% of the effort and prototype is another 10, you spend the remaining 85 getting your product built and out the door. And there's so many considerations. I'm not going to dive into them now, but can it be scaled up for manufacturability? Is it going to be at a cost point once you've done designing it for manufacturability that you can sustain? Reliability, in that, will it work every time? That's your customer's expectation. Have you considered usability? The aesthetic of the device does matter. All these elements. So just kind of fast forward, we moved through that phase. We acquired our regulatory approvals in the US. And then kind of the next stage is really first in man and early clinical, early clinical evaluation. Up until the point that we're at here in this case study, we've developed a medical device, but I wouldn't say that at this point we've advanced medicine. And the next step is equally as challenging, which is to say, you have a technology that does what you think it does, right? It ablates tissue in a reliable way. And is that going to have a meaningful impact in the patient care pathway for patients with bony mets? Is the second part of the equation. And then of course it starts here. And this is just a case study. This is one of the first patients that we treated. It's a 78-year-old male. And he was in severe pain based on the growth that you can see there on the left side of the vertebral body, right as we see it. And this particular tumor had been refractory to chemo and radiotherapy, which is why we were going to try to treat him. He had been referred to a pain specialist for palliation at this point. And so this is the electrode. That kind of dark band you see there is just a radio peak band that lets us know that that's the extent of the lesion going out proximally towards the back. So the lesion was created. You can't see the lesion on fluoroscopy, but it was created inside the vertebral body. The next step was to introduce cement to stabilize. And in the post-op radiographs, this is what the stabilization looked like. So kind of from a functional standpoint, it was an excellent outcome, and the patient's pain had been reduced to about a 2-week follow-up. And so, you would have a consequential reduction in pain medications and improvement in quality of life. And so this is kind of it's a case study just to kind of bring it to life, I think, a little bit. But there's so much that we learn over the course of the first 10 or 100 patients, all the nuances of which are the right patients, which aren't the right patients, and so forth. And just some examples for Osteocool that we found that like highly avascular, not bony, but more avascular tumors triggered high impedance errors. And highly vascularized tumors revealed some limitations of our control system, how we were controlling power. They were challenging. You get very poor imaging quality in patients with degenerated spines. That made accurate placement of our technology really tough for the IR. And we had limitations with our access tools for certain patients. And so, you know, in a way, getting it launched and into first in man is just, again, just the first step in a kind of continual journey to achieve a meaningful advance in medicine. We had to develop patient selection criteria, procedural techniques. We had to make technology updates and fight our way into understanding how the care pathways could be modulated. So where were we in 2012, 2013? I mentioned we had the regulatory approvals, the early clinical validations were complete. And we found ourselves with no real established sales channel into interventional radiologists. And we were struggling to educate what was a very multidisciplinary and busy cancer care team about how to use Osteocool. And so we were able to get into cases here at Sunnybrook and with other cooperative healthcare centers, but scaling and making it a sustainable business, we were finding it challenging. And just to take a step back in time to provide some context, back in 2007, Medtronic acquired a Kyphon for a staggering $3.9 billion. And what Kyphon had was a technology for balloon kyphoplasty. And the idea here is that not only would you put cement in the spine, but the first thing you would do is inflate a balloon, create a cavity, and then put the cement in the spine. And this was fairly well integrated into the cancer care pathway for patients with bony mets. And because we were out at trade shows and actively engaged both in the US and Canada in treating patients with our technology, Medtronic was aware of it, and they met us at a trade show, and one thing led to another. They thought this was a very good fit for their portfolio, basically. That they were already treating patients along this care continuum, and that they could fit Osteocool there and dramatically improve its reach. And so the way that it worked is, as I mentioned, there were technological limitations to it. Not only that, but Medtronic wanted to have our technology fit with their balloon kyphoplasty access tools. So all the tools they already had, our technology had to integrate with it seamlessly. And so what we agreed to do is basically redevelop the system from the ground up. Now, not changing the fundamental technologies, but how the machine was designed and made was entirely built from the ground up. It was built so that it would be, it would harmonize with the tools they already had. And in start of 2016, we launched basically the redesigned Osteocool RF ablation system. And it was Medtronic that launched it around July 1, 2016. And the scale that they were able to bring to bear was just so much different than we could. We were struggling to do, 10 cases a month was a great month. And then they rolled this out to 800 sales reps across North America and into Europe as well. It did some really neat things for us. So although we divested the technology and Medtronic provided the commercialization engine, we continue to this day, and we hope to, for years in the future, be the contract manufacturer for the devices. And so not only was there an exit, but there's also, we've developed a sustainable business in manufacturing the devices that are still sold around the world. And it's interesting how this happens, but it provides a sort of second reason to get out of bed in the morning, because not only are you improving the lives of people around the world, but you're creating jobs in your own backyard as well. And I feel personally very proud of the fact that there would be 12 production staff that come to work every day just to build Osteocool probes to treat people worldwide. It's really awesome. After Medtronic launched, one final, patient care story. This is Irma Banks. She was the 10th woman in the world to have this procedure once it relaunched with Medtronic. She had breast cancer and a mastectomy. She was in remission for 10 years. She started having a lot of back pain. It turned out that it was that the cancer had reemerged and metastasized or grown in the spine. It was localized, and so part of her care pathway was to be treated with Osteocool. Her pain went from what she called a 17 out of 10 to basically 0. And she went on immediately thereafter, knowing that life was precious, to go on a 15-state road trip with her husband and was back to gardening. And so we got this testimonial from the Macon Herald, I think it's called, in Macon, Georgia, shortly after we relaunched with Medtronic, and it made our days, as you can imagine. It's a wonderful, wonderful testimonial. I mentioned this already. One of the neat things that happened is, and again, something we didn't predict, but in going through this journey, we actually came to a place where we started a separate business unit inside of Baylis, which is development and manufacturing services. And so we're able to not only now focus on growing our cardiology business, but we have a part of our business that's focused solely on advancing medicine related to the platform that we've partnered with Medtronic on. So in the interest of time, I'll skip over this and jump into a few of the pearls. From a regulatory and affairs and market access standpoint, I talked a bit about the 510K, and if your product is 510K eligible, which means that is it of a particular class that doesn't require pre-market notification, which are typically burdened with large clinical studies before you're allowed to sell. It's good to start in the US because both Canadian and EU regulators, I think, are encouraged by having a US approval in place. Basically, the US system is extremely structured and rigorous, and it helps you. It's kind of, it's like putting a little pedigree on your resume to say, I've got this, now I can do other things. The 510K is an extremely structured framework. It's very, very rules-based. So if you study the requirements, provide a very detailed technical basis for substantial equivalence, you can navigate through it. I should mention that the entire framework is based on technical, or a substantial equivalence, I should say, that you can identify a product on the market that is used for the same indication and you could say is substantially the same. And so we were able to point to Define in this example, as well as using that RETA system, and say we're substantially equivalent. Both are emitting RF energy to treat tumors in the spine, and there's no differences in terms of safety and effectiveness. And this is where choosing predicates based on technological similarities comes in, and the indications have to be the right indications for you. They have to be the indications you can sell with. And then once you have the indications you can sell with, go find the product that has the technological similarities that you can point to when you submit a 510K to the FDA. A neat thing about, and this is I think a misconception for a lot of folks, is that a 510K process is typically, from an evidence standpoint, limited to bench validation. So you typically don't need to go into animal or clinical validation data. You may be doing it anyways to make sure you've developed a world-class technology. That's probably the case, but you don't need to submit all that to the FDA. You want to make it very lean and surgical when you prepare your application. They're governed by the rules that say if you're substantially equivalent to a predicate, then they will grant, and there's no red flags for safety and efficacy, then they will grant the market clearance. And so if one of the things you can do is try to mine information about what did your predicate, what did they submit to the FDA? If you can find that out, it becomes a little bit easier. If they only submitted bench data, you can just submit bench data, and you're still in a conversation of whether or not that's enough, but it just keeps the entire problem a little bit smaller and more contained. One of the other things that's, I think, useful to understand is that tool-like indications are easier than clinical indications. And what I mean by that is, in the Osteocool example, that this is a tool for creating lesions in vertebral bodies, metastatic lesions in vertebral bodies. If we claimed that this was a tool for palliating pain or significantly improving pain, we would have to prove that we treat pain. And it's a more challenging thing to prove, obviously, particularly with pain. And so a lot of indications are structured that it's a tool that does a particular thing, and that gets you into the market. Once you're in, then the clinical application, the fact that your tool does, let's say, treat pain, can be established by the medical community. So published in medical journals, that kind of thing. So for intellectual property, I think the first thing, and there would probably be a pretty strong support network here already, but make sure you just educate yourself on the importance of it. Be very, very careful with disclosure. Don't publicly disclose your ideas. It's one thing to talk with your friends, but don't publicly disclose. As I mentioned, reviewing adjacent IP and drilling down can improve both your design and your IP portfolio. When it comes time to file, you should use a lawyer, but you can do a lot of the preliminary work yourself to make it less expensive. Jurisdiction matters. US, if that's your major market, go there. But I mentioned that we were surprised to find out that Japan would be a major market for us for the energy needle. And because that was hard to predict, we didn't necessarily have IP protection there. And so, these are kind of watch-outs. A solid IP portfolio, including a patent fence, obviously adds substantial value if a potential exit is on the horizon. It is important for sure there. The other thing is just having it opens doors for cross-licensing and horse trading. So if you're a little bit stepping on somebody's IP and they're a little bit stepping on your IP, you can kind of trade and say, okay, I'll license you mine, you license me yours, and we go on with our business. So it's not all competitive. Sometimes you get that collaborative in the same space. Having the horse to trade, though, gives you leverage. In terms of development and collaboration, I think I've covered these. You start at the tissue, leverage your collaborative research opportunities. You guys would know this, 3D printers, proto tooling has changed the game. That's all you need to get into bench and animal work. To keep your tech hurdles low. The other thing is you will need a quality system at some point. You can purchase them right out of the box, ready to go, that will satisfy regulatory requirements, and they're not hard to learn. So don't let anybody tell you it's a expensive, arduous undertaking. It's not that bad. The smarts it takes to get to this point, this is not so hard. I guess a note on clinical plan too, that again, I think it's obvious, but clinical evidence comes in a ton of forms, and that RCTs, like big controlled trials, large commercial organizations are much better suited to running these studies during post-market scale-up. These are not DIY. They're full of pitfalls. The issue is that you've got a heterogeneous disease and a heterogeneous patient population, and trying to control those hundreds of variables to demonstrate that your device does what you say it does is, if you don't understand your market extremely well, your patients extremely well, high risk of an RCT not working out properly, and they're extremely expensive. What you do need to do is simply support the face validity of your therapy. So the weight of evidence that you have from your idea, from your preclinical work, when you talk to other clinicians about it, doesn't make sense. And I'm sure it will, and that is the main thing. They're going to look at it and say, that's a good idea. And all you have to do is support, not all, but you have to support that face validity with a weight of evidence that can be accumulated from case studies and much easier to attain clinical evidence. And this is ultimately what you build your marketing narrative around. You can build a marketing narrative around this. You don't necessarily need RCTs. And this is my last slide. I apologize for going a bit over. For sales channels and exit, you should plan for larger markets. I mentioned that Canada is hard to have a sustainable business just selling in Canada. US is, depending on the class of the device, fairly straightforward to gain access to, and obviously it's close. Other markets like Germany and Japan, obviously large markets. The EU is reasonably easy, or not easy, but it is accessible from a regulatory standpoint, but hard to travel to. Japan is a little harder to access from a regulatory standpoint, and harder to travel to, obviously. There's direct sales versus distribution. As a small organization, distribution is probably the way you go, but it's certainly possible to do direct sales. Not every sale is a good sale. Not every patient is a good patient. You know, I think we're all aware of the stereotype of the surgeon or the clinician who is stuck in their ways and they don't want to change. Don't force it on that person. The likelihood of a less than optimal outcome with that clinician is much higher because they're not bought in. And go and look for the folks that do believe in you and your technology and start there, and they'll help you take the next steps. Eventually, when 60 or 80% of clinicians are using your technology, like say in that hospital or in a region, the guy that didn't want to change his ways is going to change his tune. Planning to exit isn't a plan. You don't control it. All you can do is plan to build a sustainable business. You may hope to exit. You may have a bunch of strategies to get there, but it's not a plan. And I guess it's unavoidable in certain cases that if things don't go well, you can run out of funds. But don't make it because you said, I'm going to set an arbitrary date by which I'm going to exit and have all my cash flow taper out to that date. Really focus on a sustainable business first and foremost. When it does come time to exit, these are a few notes that one of the folks on our advisory board is a GM for a unit at Medtronic, separate from the Osteocool thing. And we had a conversation about this recently, and he said, okay, there's a few things if we're acquiring that we're looking for. That the tech or the therapy has face validity and a solid foundation of preclinical and clinical weight of evidence, as I was just saying, that the narrative, they have to believe in it. It has to be sound. Certainly sound regulatory indications that they feel they can sell to. A strong IP portfolio, and as I mentioned before, the freedom to operate has to be clear. They're looking for device durability, so they want to see in and around 100 cases to know that you did design for manufacture and reliability properly, that you're not having a failure rate of 50% of your devices in the field, because then they're going to have to acquire it, and they might acquire it anyways and go and re-engineer it, but it's better if you've worked out the kinks ahead of time. Or as is the case with Osteocool, you know, we said, okay, there's a bunch of skeletons in the closet, and they said, okay, well then let's just redevelop the system. And so I think being honest and actually knowing what the skeletons are is very helpful. Sales proof of principle does matter. So not only is this a good idea, getting first in man is a huge accomplishment. Getting your first sale is an equally huge accomplishment because it means somebody believes in the idea so much that they're willing to spend money on it. So sales proof of principle is important, but it doesn't mean it has to be in a big geography. So even sustained sales in a small geography is actually ideal because it just proves the principle that this is a sellable device, and you haven't gone and mucked up the rest of the world with your not that sophisticated marketing strategy. That's what these guys do. They're extremely sophisticated marketing engines, and they'll then take this proof of principle and they'll scale it. And that's the last point. But that's their business, and they don't need you to do that for them necessarily. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rob. This was a very good presentation. I think you touched upon many important aspects in the medical technology innovation journey, from choosing a clinical need that really deserves all the effort, to choosing the right people with the right set of skills to be on board, to the benefit of having competitors and having a market or creating a market, and even to the point of collaborating with these competitors, and finally to having an early sales and market strategy early on in the development process. That was really great. I think at this point I'll just open it for questions. So.
I have a question. What's your process for finding?
That's a great question. We just had an all-day meeting today talking about what are our strategies for R&D towards 2020, and one of them is indeed to strengthen our pipeline. There are a few. Certainly, you could look to anywhere where complication rates are unacceptably high and meaningful, and go in and say, okay, well, why is that? And is technology part of the solution? Another thing you can do, and it happened here for Osteocool, is that, and I meant to bring this up, If you see that a technology has been shoehorned into a different application, it means there's a proof of principle for that application, but nobody's designed it specifically for the application. That's often fertile ground. So you could say, okay, and it does happen even with big companies like Covidien had CoolTip, and doctors were shoehorning CoolTip into vertebral body ablation, and Covidien just wasn't pursuing it. The market, for whatever reason, maybe that wasn't of interest to them. And so just because it's a large organization doesn't mean they're going to pursue it, and that's might be an open door for you to go in. It's certainly just, and being outside of our four walls is essential. So it's being in the clinic. I mean, you guys would know this. It's being at the clinic. It's going to the conferences. It's engaging with thought leaders and studying.
Another questions? Regarding the market assessment, for a startup company, where you have an idea and not development by the how they can start a market analysis? Is there to do the organization to do that, or they have to do that, or at which stage they have to do that?
Yeah.
They have an idea, but they don't know how much it's like it costs. So to do that, they have to have a proof of concept, prototype, and then they do the market analysis, or they have to do the market analysis.
Yeah, I would do it early. I think it's in feasibility phase, and you can do this. There's a couple ways. So the literature is going to have a lot of it. So certainly, kind of narrowing in on the number of patients, the addressable market. So the number of patients that can be treatable. You should be able to pull a lot of that out of the scientific or the medical literature. And this is where making your problem small is important. Resist the urge to inflate the market. Make it real. Like, force it down and down and down. Say, who am I really going after? The number gets better and better when you do that, more realistic when you do that. The other thing is that there are organizations like Millennium Research Group that every year they create market research reports. They're fairly expensive, but they are extremely detailed, and they have access to data that you don't have access to. And so acquiring one of those reports will give you very current and detailed information on the size of the market that you're pursuing.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can comment on USFDA's design history files, and in particular, if you've experienced any situations where the design history files together properly during the device design phase and it makes the pathway market much more important.
Yeah, for sure that can happen. And so understanding the requirements of the 510K framework in this example and building your DHF with that in mind matters. And so, you create documentation for a few reasons. One is that to manufacture, to own a design for a medical device, you have to comply with a couple standards, 13485, and there's a part of the Code of Federal Regulations in the US that cover design controls. And so you have to have a quality system that complies with those things. And they basically govern, this is what your DHF shall be. And so you're writing your DHF with really three people in mind. You're writing it so that other technical people in your company in the future can understand how your device is designed and how it's made. For auditors, if you ever get audited, somebody who's going to say, do you have a good quality system? They have to look at it and say, yep, this is a good quality system. But the most important, I would argue, is that it's for your regulatory team, which will be you, that you can leverage those documents in your 510K submission or in your submission to a notified body for CE approval. And this becomes particularly important around the areas of risk management and around the VMV testing, verification and validation bench testing that you're ultimately going to submit.
Thank you for the interesting case study. I'm visiting here from Australia. I was interested in the supply chain, global supply chains into places like Australia to use devices used there. What are some of the challenges you have with respect to the global supply chains and the support that's probably needed?
Yeah.
And the other thing I was interested in your collaboration with this institute in developing this device. What are the challenges there?
Yeah, certainly. So in terms of global supply chain, the supply chain part of it is okay. The direct sales into such a far away location is challenging. We've never had direct sales. What we did when we sold into Australia with interventional pain is that we had a distributor, and that distributor, it was a good business fit, and so supporting them from afar was not particularly challenging. Given how easy it is to communicate around the world, that wasn't a major issue. But certainly they needed in-person support as well. Interestingly, what happened was a few of the thought leaders, there's a fellow named Nick Bogdak, who is really sort of one of the grandfathers of interventional pain, is in Australia. And it gave us two reasons to be there, was to go and interact with some of the folks that were really leading the way in that area, but also to kind of set up the distribution business simultaneously. So I don't know if there's any other particular challenges, but there's opportunities there too. In terms of setting up the collaboration with Sunnybrook, there's acquiring the grants and things like that, which, it's work. Sometimes the other issue is that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get out at the end. So you enter these collaborations saying, I have an idea, and they say, okay, I understand your idea, and here's some of the things that we could do to add this face validity to it. And so it's kind of like an evolving process that starts nebulously saying, let's collaborate. And then it crystallizes to the point that you have, a really structured research plan that ultimately results in publications. And so I think it's the nebulousness, it's not a word, but of the journey that's, I think, challenging. Yeah.
More questions?
Okay, what sort of payback period do you look for these type of devices?
That's a good question that I don't have the answer. As a startup, so cash flow is critical. We're obviously, I think, to get to a point where you can scale sustainably, you keep your eye on it very, very carefully. And the major outlays, the risks of major cash outlays have to be very carefully weighed against what that's going to do for your cash flow. In terms of the payback, I couldn't answer it. I'm not sure.
Your feasibility checklist, you didn't burden the payback period. Is that a serious consideration at that stage?
Yeah, I would think it is. Yeah, I don't think you would want to be underwater for very long. I think all the opportunities are going to be different, but and it just depends. Can you afford to be underwater for very long on a project, right? So if it's a $1 million outlay, how long can you float $1 million before you're back? Yeah. So I don't know if we have an exact rule of thumb that I could give you. Yeah.
You mentioned the OCE as a grant or as a funding. Is there any other funders that you would like to mention? And also,
yep.
The whole process of
okay. Okay, great. Yeah. There are absolutely. So we've had a really good relationship with some of the OCE in particular. There's been other organizations. There was HTX, which I think has closed out, Health Technology Exchange, which we were able to utilize, and then NSERC for sure. And it happens at multiple levels too. Like we can use NSERC, for example, to fund a student to work with us either at the office or collaboratively, like fund a student to be at Sunnybrook, but work on a collaboration project with us. And so we've leveraged some of the NSERC opportunities. But those are the major ones, and they do come and go. So these initiatives come, they last for a couple of years, and then the funds are spent. And then, new versions of them come along. Yeah. So regarding intellectual property, there is, you have to get educated around IP and what is a patent and around claims construction. So when you write a patent, you're effectively claiming a few things that are novel about your technology and non-obvious. And in order to get those granted, the USPTO, let's say in the US, is going to review those claims, and they have to agree with you that nobody's done this before, it's novel, and it's not obvious to anybody skilled in the area, that what you've done is truly inventive. And it's a real thought process. It's different than anything else you'll do here, to get in and try to unravel that puzzle. And I think it does start with looking at some of the intellectual property that's adjacent to you, understanding what claims they have, and then trying to bring your inventive concept down to its most fundamental roots. So often it's to do with the energy, application of force or application of energy in a new way. You bring it all the way down to like the physics level, and then see how broad of a claim you can get. The more work you do on your own to that end, the stronger your patent will be, and also the less expensive the legal costs will be to get it filed. Because then, if you've more or less taken a good crack at structuring it, the lawyers will help you like fine tune it, but then it will require less time. The other thing you can do is do your own drawings. So get all your own patent drawings to effectively describe your inventive concepts with illustrations. So another piece that you don't have to outsource, you can do yourself. The process is that once you engage with the lawyers, you file something called a provisional. You then have a year to go on with your development before you have to file what's called a non-provisional, or you would call it a formal application. The provisional gets the date. So the date that you submit the provisional, then anything that comes after that, you have priority. You're the first to invent. You have then a year to like further your development. Say, okay, this is what I really have. This is the patent that I have, and then it becomes a non-provisional. That goes to the USPTO, and then there's a process that goes on for years where they work with you and the lawyer that you work with to kind of negotiate the claims. Yeah, so it's a long process, and it's as I said, there's benefits to starting early. It's not critical that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but spend a little bit of time thinking about it.
By the way, we're having 2 lectures scheduled in November. Just thought about this. That both of them will address like the financing and the kind of strategies that innovators need to think of early on in the innovation process in terms of how to speak out to, reach out to investors, how to raise capital, the kind of all the financing issues, like how to think about valuations and work with cap tables and everybody. So it's going to be very useful. Questions around medtech financing. I guess this concludes our session today. Thank you, Rob, so much for being our guest lecturer today, and thank you for joining us. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.